We had been warned for months, not quietly, not subtly. We were warned with certainty. They told us the Americans were undisciplined, emotional, and unpredictable. That they hated prisoners, especially women in uniform. That surrender meant humiliation, hunger, and fear without end. Those stories followed us everywhere, in barracks, on night watches, even in our sleep. By the spring of 1945, most of us were no longer soldiers in spirit, only in name. We were tired, not just from marching in shortages, but from knowing the war was already lost, even if no one said it out loud. When the order finally came to surrender, no one cried. Fear had already drained us. The American vehicles appeared slowly, deliberately. No rush, no chaos, just engines humming and boots hitting the ground in steady rhythm. We were told to step forward, hands visible, no sudden movements. This was the moment we had been preparing for. The shouting should have started then. The insults, the rage. But the men in front of us did not look angry. They looked focused. One of them read names from a list. Another watched the perimeter. A third adjusted his helmet and glanced at the sky, as if this were just another long day. Then something happened that none of us expected. A guard spoke to us, in German. It wasn't good German. The accent was heavy, but the words were clear. Stay together. No one will be hurt. No mockery. No raised voice. That sentence hit harder than any threat ever could, because fear makes sense. Cruelty makes sense in war. Calm did not. We exchanged quick glances, unsure how to react. Some of us tightened our grip on nothing at all, our weapons already gone. This was not the enemy we had imagined, and that realization made everything suddenly feel unstable. After the surrender, we waited, not for orders, for consequences. We were moved into a temporary holding area, an old building that smelled of dust and damp wood. The door closed behind us, and for a moment, no one spoke. This was usually when fear took shape, when guards reminded prisoners who was in control. But outside, the Americans spoke quietly among themselves. No laughter, no shouting. Minutes passed, then longer. Eventually, the door opened again. A guard stepped inside, alone. He carried no weapon in his hands. His posture was firm, but his voice was steady as he explained, slowly, clearly, what would happen next. Where we would sleep, when food would come, what was expected of us. It felt unreal. We had prepared ourselves to be treated as trophies, as warnings, as something to be broken. Instead, we were being processed, methodically, almost impersonally. One woman near the back whispered, "This is a trick." We all believed that, because kindness in war never felt permanent. Later that evening, we were given food, simple rations, nothing generous, but enough, and clean water. Some of us hadn't seen clean water in days. No one rushed us. No one stood over us. An American guard noticed hands trembling as we ate. He looked away, giving privacy instead of attention. That small gesture stayed with us. At night, as we lay on thin mattresses, the building quiet except for distant footsteps, the fear didn't disappear, but it changed shape. We were no longer afraid of what would happen next. We were afraid that everything we had been told was wrong, and if that was true, then we had been fighting in a world built on lies. By the third day, we understood one thing clearly. This was not temporary. We were transferred deeper into a permanent POW camp. The fences were real. The watchtowers were real. There was no illusion of freedom, but there was also no chaos. Everything ran on schedules. Roll call at the same time every morning. Meals at fixed hours. Medical checks done carefully, without shouting or rushing. We had imagined camps filled with punishment and constant intimidation. Instead, we found order, cold, strict, but controlled. The barracks were plain wooden structures, no comfort, no privacy. But they were dry, heated just enough to survive the night. Each of us was assigned a cot, a blanket, a number, not a name. And yet, even that felt strange. because no one used the number to humiliate us. One afternoon, a medic stopped during inspection when he noticed swollen hands on one of the women. He asked questions, took notes, returned later with bandages. No one laughed. No one rushed him. We began noticing details that didn't fit the image we were given. Guards followed rules strictly. They corrected each other if someone spoke too harshly. They avoided unnecessary contact. Once, a guard raised his voice during roll call. Another stepped in quietly and said something we couldn't hear. The shouting stopped immediately. That moment stayed with us, because it showed restraint, not fear, not weakness, but discipline. At night, lying awake on narrow cots, we listened to the sounds of the camp. Boots on gravel, distant voices, a generator humming somewhere beyond the fence. This was captivity, but it was not cruelty, and that realization was more unsettling than hunger or cold, because it meant the enemy we were taught to hate was behaving better than the world we came from. The days in the camp began to blur together, not because they were easy, but because nothing dramatic happened. No punishments, no sudden changes, just routine. And in that routine, something unexpected began to appear. Conversation. It started small, a guard asking if anyone spoke English, another correcting our pronunciation when we tried to answer. Short exchanges, careful, distant. But they kept happening. One afternoon during work detail, an American guard asked where we were from, not as a question of guilt, just curiosity. When someone answered, he nodded and said he had never been there. That was it. No judgment, no commentary. Another time, a guard spoke about home, about a farm, about missing the quiet more than anything else. He didn't ask us to agree. He didn't ask us to explain ourselves. He just spoke. That confused us more than silence ever had. We had been taught that the enemy saw us only as symbols of defeat, of ideology, of blame. But here were men who talked about sisters, weather, food, and how tired they were of uniforms. They didn't try to humiliate us with power. They didn't demand gratitude. They treated conversation like something human, not strategic. At night, we whispered about it. Why are they like this? What do they gain from it? No one had an answer, because if this behavior was real, if it wasn't an act, then the image we had carried into captivity was collapsing piece by piece. And once that happens, you can't rebuild the old beliefs the same way again. The moment came without warning. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no alarms. It happened during morning roll call. We were standing in formation when one of the women near the front began to sway. At first, no one reacted. Weakness was something you learned to hide. But then she collapsed, her knees giving way before anyone could reach her. For a heartbeat, the camp froze. Then the Americans moved. 2 guards broke formation immediately. One knelt beside her, lifting her head carefully. The other called out, not angrily but urgently, for a medic. No one shouted at the rest of us. No one accused. No one punished. We were told to sit down. The medic arrived quickly, checked her pulse, spoke calmly, and ordered her taken to the infirmary. Before she was carried away, one guard covered her with his jacket. That image burned itself into our memory. Later that day, an announcement came. Roll call would be shortened for the next few mornings. "Some prisoners are still recovering," the guard said. That was all. No lectures, no threats. That was when something broke inside us. Not fear, but resistance. Because cruelty would have confirmed everything we were taught. But restraint forced us to question it. That night, many of us didn't sleep. We lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, realizing that the war hadn't only taken our freedom, it had taken our certainty. After the incident at roll call, the camp felt different. Nothing on paper had changed. The schedules were the same, the fences were still there, but inside us, something had shifted. At night, when the lights dimmed and the guards' footsteps faded into the distance, we whispered to each other in the dark. Not about escape, not about blame, about confusion. Some admitted they had expected punishment after the collapse. Others confessed they had been waiting for cruelty to finally reveal itself. It never did. One woman said quietly that she felt more afraid now than before, not of the guards, but of what it meant if they were not the monsters we were warned about. Another whispered something that silenced us all. If this is how they treat the defeated, then who were we really fighting? No one answered, because once that question exists, it doesn't go away. We began to notice how the guards avoided unnecessary force, how they followed rules even when no one seemed to be watching, how small acts, looking away, slowing down, correcting each other, kept happening. Those were not accidents, they were choices, and that realization weighed heavily. War had taught us to survive by certainty. Captivity was teaching us to survive by doubt. That night, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the wind move through the fences, many of us understood something painful and irreversible. The war hadn't only ended our freedom, it had ended the version of the world we believed in. Time passed. Not quickly, but steadily enough for reflection to take root. Transfers were announced weeks later. Some of us would be sent home, others to different camps. The war, we were told, was ending, not with celebration, but with paperwork and silence. On our last morning in the camp, we stood one final time at roll call. The same fences, the same towers, the same guards. Nothing dramatic happened. An American officer read names. When someone misheard, he repeated them patiently. A medic shook hands with the woman he had treated weeks earlier. One guard nodded to us, not as a warning, but as acknowledgement. No speeches, no triumph. As we were escorted toward the trucks, we looked back, not at the fences, but at the men who had stood between us and fear. Years later, when people asked what captivity was like, we struggled to explain. We could talk about hunger, about exhaustion, about defeat. But what stayed with us most was something quieter. We expected cruelty and prepared ourselves for it. We were ready to be broken. Instead, we were treated as defeated humans, not enemies to be erased. They did not shout. They did not humiliate. They did not take advantage of power. They followed rules when no one forced them to. They showed restraint when cruelty would have been easier. They reminded us, without words, that even in war, choices still exist. They were not what we expected, and that realization followed us home into a world trying to rebuild itself. A world where we could no longer pretend that humanity belonged to only one side.